Just to jump in, I also think to think about the tension between insider outsider, because I think to your point, the film you made had so much to do with your insider knowledge. I also think there are films that are beautifully made that can only be made from an outsider, because they're bringing in an awareness and a new eyes or a new observation. So it really is, story specific. Or maybe one person makes an insider film as an outsider makes the same film, but it's going to be a totally different film because the perspectives are different.
Well, I think any other filmmaker that's not a surf filmmaker would be like, why are the surfers not showing up at the time we said they're supposed to be here too? That was a real thing. So I am used to that in the world that I live in. So I'm like, all right, they'll come maybe in an hour, maybe 2 hours, and
punctually challenged.
I've worked with non-surf filmmakers on surfing projects, and they are baffled. They're like, I've never worked on a set like this. I'm like, yeah, it's not really a set. Surfers are great though. Surfers in my film are great.
Those are all such great answers, and they kind of speak to that nuanced relationship between you and your participants, and the way that who you are and your perspective changes the film that you make, and whether it's through access or your lens, or I think there's so much beautiful nuance in all of this. So thank you all for those answers. Jumping into the misinformation portion of our prompt, have you dealt with any misinformation on your topics? And I am specifically looking at Andrea and Abby on this one, but
mine is rift with misinformation. But I think is dealing with it is dealing with the human stories, dealing with the personal stories. As I said before, dealing with the lived experience. I think that's what cuts through the misinformation and allows people to see beyond this fog of misinformation. So to me, it's trying to break down what that misinformation is, so you're aware of it and aware of the context, but then how can you find a pathway through it? And for me, that pathway was finding the humanity. And as we've been talking about, relating to our characters through empathy and understanding, and instead of judgment. So everyone is the exhausted majority, I'm sure, and as the days close in on the election, we're all feeling that sense of just fatigue. And when is both this rhetoric going to change? When is the temperature going to change? And we like to make just this kind of joke amongst ourselves as the filmmakers that our main goal ultimately was to try to make Thanksgiving normal again.
So there's a lot of misinformation about abortion, there's stigma about it, there is stereotypes about who gets abortions, and I think what excited me so much about making the film that we did make is that these women are the first people to testify in court since Roe took the stand to fight for women's rights, and it's such a difficult decision to decide to be the face of abortion when it is something that has been so hotly contested for so long. And so I think it made it easier for us as filmmakers, because they were ready to tell their stories, they were out there, they were determined to flip the narrative. And I think there has been a lot of rhetoric about these laws they have exceptions. If somebody really needed it, they could get an abortion in Texas, and this film just shatters that. And I think it's because these women came forward and they're like, I'm a real person, and I was denied care and forced to go septic rather than be given the abortion I needed to survive. And so I think it is just women telling their stories is actually how you break these misconceptions.
Yeah, in our film, there's actually a really big piece of misinformation that we debunk. There's the myth of the cigarette filter actually improving the health of smoking for the smoker. That is not true. And we were faced with, how do we kind of tell that? How are we going to actually convey that? And how is that going to be, the right way to, we're not going to tell that narration. We learned that long before we did an interview with this tobacco waste expert, this public health professor. And he breaks it down. We follow an experiment a study that's going on that is debunking this myth. And that is something that I don't know how many of you knew that the filter was just a marketing ploy by the tobacco industry in the 1960s, that after the Surgeon General's report came out, they're like, we need to now make it seem like smoking is safer because of the filter. No scientific proof to that. So our film, even though it's not largely this debunking these big myths, that is one part that felt, I haven't really seen that in other media or films. And I actually just read a New York Times article the other day that totally unrelated to this topic, but they used the example of a filtered cigarette filtering out the carcinogens, and I emailed them. I'm like, that's not true, even though the article had nothing to do that was just an example that someone had used. But that's something that's so deep in our understanding of or maybe our misunderstanding of the truth of cigarettes. And so we had the right person, the guy who is the cigarette butt expert of the world, come in our film, even though it's mostly a surfing film. We're
What's
we
his
need.
Title, Ben?
His title is Doctor. What's that?
What's his title?
In the film?
Cigarette butt expert. I'm just wondering, does he go around?
I don't think he goes by that. Yeah, that was colloquial.
Okay.
Professor of public health at San Diego State University.
That's fine.
Yeah, I'm not spreading misinformation here. I think he would take that though. He is, the top guy in that field. And so we knew even though it's a surfing film, we have to bring in this scientist to debunk this myth, the most qualified person versus a surfer who learned this a couple years ago, stating that fact. So choosing the right people in a situation like that to tell that part of the story.
Yeah, that expertise definitely helps.
The only other thing I was going to say about misinformation, and this I learned just by following our characters, and Jack in particular. Misinformation, I see, breeds when you're in isolation, when you're siloed. And so these stories that we're telling, presenting a larger context, presenting more complexities, trying to show audiences the nuance and that things aren't reflexive, they're not binary, they're not black and white. How can, we accept to just stay in that gray space? That too is a way with our stories that we counter misinformation.
Absolutely. And in terms of thinking about that audience that may not agree with you or that may have some bias against what you're showing, whether because of misinformation or otherwise, how much do you take that perspective into account when you are making your films, when you're crafting your final cut and you're thinking about how the story is going to unfold? Is that something that you see as, if you just tell the story as it is, then that is the best way to, combat that? Or do you think about specific things that you need to be refuting or debunking in the decisions that you're making in your storytelling? How much is that potentially antagonistic viewer a part of your kind of landscape of your mind when you're putting your films together?
Really good question. You're making
Finally
us think
stumped
of
you.
these, I can speak for myself that I've been in
The edit cave and just making kind of frame by frame decisions, and these are really big questions that you're having us kind of step back, step outside, and start to think about. Tell me the question again. Jet lag.
How much are you thinking about a viewer?
Okay, yeah. So I think less about the viewer and more about, am I staying true to my own voice and my perspective? We did consider that we wanted to make a film that appealed to people beyond our own chorus, so that was important to us. But I factored that in more in the marketing and less in my storytelling. My storytelling, I just was focused on being as honest, as transparent, and as, it's not neutral, but to be able to just allow the audience in on this journey with me, and to be able to have them be presented with enough information about each of our characters that they can formulate their own opinions. I didn't want to force that or impose it, but I think that as you go on the journey with us, people come out of our film with different opinions depending on their frame of reference.
It's really well put. We knew that we didn't want to just preach to the choir of people that would already agree with the environmental sentiment of littering cigarette butts or ocean conservation, and that was a really hard thing to do. It's hard to get out of that echo chamber of, obviously people are going to want to come see our film who are surfers, who are maybe already aligned environmentally, but how do we get both surfers who might not see an environmental documentary to come out and see the film? Because there's a large subset of the surfing population that I don't think are exactly ocean stewards or could be doing more to protect the ocean in their own ways. And also, how do we get a non-surfing audience to come to our film and not have it be too much of a surf film? So that question was really alive in the editing process. How much do we, blending that surf film, environmental documentary, and maybe as an insider, as a surfer myself, there could have been, I had to hire an editing consultant who specifically was not a surfer to come in and tell me what I already knew was to cut the surfing, and cut the surfing, and cut the surfing. Because for me, I love watching surfing. It's such a beautiful way of seeing humans interact with the ocean. And what's been really interesting is that at screenings, I've actually found that landlocked audiences, inland audiences, people that don't surf, are more into the surfing segments, probably because they don't see surfing all that much, and it is this very mesmerizing thing. And the way we chose to have those surfing scenes play out would be, it's not just the tripod on land angle, wave after wave after wave, which can be that way in a surfing film, but to be water shot to land shot to drone, and then as soon as it starts feeling too much, bring back in some story. And the surfing was really just serving as that breath away from the documentary. But yeah, getting outside of that echo chamber, getting outside of that, how do we get this film in front of people that smoke and who might flick their butts? And so that was a clear choice too, of we definitely don't want to shame anyone who is flicking their butts. We made it very clear in our own journey with this film and this project, as well as stating in the film that we are not against smoking. We're not a pro-smoking film, but we're definitely not, we didn't want to push away people that we hope this film might change their minds about flicking their butts and then the impact that has on other people in the environment.
I think we had tons of conversations about how to frame this film to make it accessible, and I think our guiding light was that this is about women, families, and healthcare. And I think abortion has been so politicized, but it doesn't have to be. And so I think just sticking true to our guiding lines of this film is created in a way that allows people to connect on a human level and remove it from a political arena and just talk about what it means to be in a medical emergency and be denied care because of a law that doctors did not write. And so, I think you see really easily that doctors who only want to do no harm are having their hands tied and unable to provide the best care possible, and are conflicted about even staying in the states they're working in. But all of that to say that I think the male engagement with the issue is something that is so important. And so we wanted to make a film that really highlights the male perspective as well, actually, because you, through the women's stories, see just how much the partners are harmed and the children of these families are harmed, watching their mother suffer, watching their sibling be buried because their mother was denied care. So it's about the framing for me and trying to make it accessible.
Oh, I mean, my film doesn't really take on misinformation. I mean, I know when I make a film, I'm not thinking of kind of the voices that are, would be in, against my idea. But I think similar to you, like the marketing, how we talk about it, the joy is to bring as many different views to see it. I would say my first film was about veteran issues, so I very much wanted people, whatever they think about war, to be able to see it. But that, I think, exactly like you, Andrea, it's more about how do we tell the story to get eyes on it versus like they're not with me as I'm editing it. I'm just trying to edit the best story by my judgment of what best is.
So we're getting close to time, but I wanted to see if anybody in the audience had any questions for our panelists. There.
I would love to know more about filming subjects that are active in a court case and how you navigate what you're allowed to say. If you lean into that struggle, just how you navigate that, especially with public defender, where theoretically you have the lawyer talking about their feelings about the cases.
It's a really good question because it also impacts how we tell the story. One of the most dramatic moments is when our defendants are sentenced, but we're not allowed to bring cameras into the courtroom. So we had to, you're forced to then think creatively. How do you capture that moment and what took place during that moment? For us, especially because Heather has such a unique approach to law, I call it kind of a holistic justice approach. She sees herself as an attorney, as a social worker, as an educator, and all of those parts of her are as important as her writing up a sentencing memo. So in our filmmaking, I thought it was important to see and bear witness to how she interacts with her clients, how she builds these relationships, how trust is formed, how that sense of transformation, maybe not what all of us would like to see, but little cracks in the door of what I saw as some light, how those happen. And the only way was to be able to just sit with the camera and follow her, which is not easy because she'll tell me that she's working on a sentencing memo one day. I get over to her house, which is very close to where our offices are, so I could just kind of pick up my camera and go. And she's making matzo ball soup. And I'm like, what happened to the sentencing memo? Well, that's going to be later. And so she's very kind of erratic or eclectic in how she schedules her time. And so it really just required us hanging around there when calls came in or when she was dealing with particular clients. And especially since she had formed such a close relationship with Annie, what was really moving was for the two of them to meet for the first time in person at our premiere, because they had only interacted over Zoom. And there weren't a lot of words that were shared, but there was such a beautiful, intense bear hug that it took a while before they broke apart from that. And it was really just special to be able to see that bond in person and not just with the camera. So there are all these considerations. There's also restrictions on what we're able to share. There were a lot of redacted moments, both in the transcripts as well as in the moments when Heather would say, please, can you step out? And we would have to respect that. But most of the time, I think she opened up an access to us that really opened my eyes to what is involved in terms of developing a relationship with a client and her form of public defending.
I feel like the attorneys in our films have a similar deep relationship with their clients.
Makes
And-
a better world. I'm happy to know that there's more of
Yeah.
Heathers out there.
And I will say, like, I spent a lot of time in the hallway during privileged conversations that I wasn't allowed to film. And in terms of filming an active court case, we had protocols about keeping footage out of Texas because we could be subpoenaed. We didn't want to open our footage up to being a part of the court case in any way. We also had to go to court ourselves to fight to get access to film in the courtroom. We hired a First Amendment attorney who successfully got us in there, but they like really restricted us. We were on one camera, on sticks, no changing the lens, no panning, no zooming, so like a stationary. So we got an 8K camera overnight.
Stationary
and
on
set that
who's
up.
speaking?
Well, they let us choose the framing, so it was
Okay,
either you could
okay.
face the lawyers or you could face the women testifying and the judge, and so we went with that framing, which I think actually really lent itself to allowing the state voice to just be the omnipresent state. And so what you see is these women, but it's such an intimate story they're telling on like the stand in such a sterile and hostile environment of a courtroom. So you really understand the vulnerability there. But we wanted to be able to get in closer on their faces because it is such an important moment for them to be speaking directly to the state. And so to that end, when we were editing, we also stripped out all of the music from the court because we wanted you to like really be in there with them and just be like, it is so difficult and uncomfortable to be speaking directly to the state about your story. So I think it was a learning curve for sure to cover an active court case, and we're really lucky that it concluded before, the court decision came out the week we were picture locking, so. Squeeze that in there.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Let's see, how are we on time? Okay, we got one more. Okay, one more question. Yeah.
Oh, how do you approach potential subjects who may be skeptical of what you're doing? Like, how do you frame to them your approach, or kind of like earn that trust in a way that doesn't feel like gross?
It's a really good question too. I think it's time as well. So when we were working with Heather's clients, she's probably now represented upwards of 45 different individuals. And there were some who just wanted to put this behind them and felt the last thing they wanted was to see their story play out on a screen and share that publicly. There were others that as we began to open up the relationship, that I saw there was a catharsis in talking to us, in having someone listen, having someone be present. They felt that they were heard and there wasn't any judgment. I remember Jack the first time I got together with him, and it was hard, but I listened for 2.5 hours to one long rant. And he goes, "Thank you for listening." So I think it's what you were saying, Ben, as well, that you start building the trust. The camera is not there all the time. And with us as well, we had many conversations off camera and questions that they were able to feel to us. So I just kind of laid down the ground rules with Heather as well. In the beginning, you can ask me any question you want, but I may not have the answer for you, or it may be a no. And if it is, then we'll talk it through. So that if you're uncomfortable with one of the decisions I've made in terms of where my camera is or how I'm capturing the particular moment, we'll talk that through. But you're able to ask questions and I'm able to ask questions, and we've got to keep it open throughout the whole process. And it's constant, I think, reinforcement of that trust. And there's kind of little mini tests, litmus tests that sometimes they'll set for you to see, are you really following what you say you are? Are you doing what you promised you do? And that's, part of that ongoing trust, I think, between a documentarian and their participants, and that collaborative sense that they feel that they can go forward with you.
Does anybody have anything to add about building trust? All right, well, thank you all so much for being here for this conversation. And thank you all for being here.